Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on what is very much becoming the fastest and perhaps hottest topic of the energy transition, which is repowering. My name is Will Black. I'm a director at ReAmp, and hopefully I've met most of you on the call. Today you're in for a bit of a treat. We've got my fellow co-director at ReAmp, Alison. Okay, I think. Are we good to start? It is 1 o'clock and I can see the counter climbing of participants. Will I maybe give them another few seconds before I kick off? Okay, perhaps starting to calm down now. Okay, well, I move on. I'll kick us off. So, as I say, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Today, we are driving into what is perhaps one of the biggest, fastest, and most exciting aspects of the energy transition, which is repowering. And today you're in for a little bit of a treat. My name's Will Black, and I'm a director here at ReAmp. But we're joined today by Alison, a fellow co-director of ReAmp, Jerry and James, who are from Eversheds. And we're going to work through some key aspects of repowering today. Both our businesses have been involved with a number of clients for some years now around repowering, and we've been building up quite a lot of corporate knowledge on it. So we wanted to continue the conversation and offer this out as a kind of next step of what we've been learning and speaking about, but we very much see this as a kind of ongoing piece. Um, Before I do kick off, and we have got 30 minutes, so it'll be a kind of packed agenda, there are some housekeeping elements that fit in. So we'll last for about half an hour today. And you're very welcome to use the Q&A feature to raise questions as we go. And in fact, I'd put a special plea out to do that. We've got a slot dedicated for questions. If you are asking a question, could you please give me your name and your email address in the Q&A? Because that allows us to actually come back to you after the session if we run out of time, or if you wanted some more clarity on the points that we kind of tried to answer. The other thing to make people aware of is the session is being recorded, and it will be made available on our website and as a podcast available through Apple or Spotify. So let's jump in. We are short of time. So the scale of what repowering brings is enormous. If you look at the renewables obligation exit timeline as a proxy, then what you can actually see is there's a cliff edge coming quite soon in 2027, actually, so only kind of really next year, of which maybe about 5 gigawatts of generation could come off the bars if people choose to stop generating outside that Arrow contract. And it keeps going actually into the early 2030s, all the way through to the mid 2030s, where actually as much as 25 gigawatts of power could come off by 2037. So quite a change about to be injected into the system. And almost every technology is going to be considered with a, do we shut it down? Do we keep going? And if we keep going, how are we going to do that? I think the story that where the most of our work in ReAmp has been is certainly around the onshore piece. You'll see that again if you look at those RO proxies, then we've got some kind of 400 megawatts of wind capacity will come up for repowering every single year from now till kind of 2030. And that's because the way that we actually built out onshore wind in the UK is we were using these market mechanisms to drive progress in renewables that would ultimately be help to achieve net zero. So that means there's hundreds of turbines across dozens of sites reaching a decision point every year from now all the way out to kind of 2037. So that will bring a significant volume of older projects, perhaps less efficient machines, hopefully being reused, perhaps recycled, or perhaps replaced as well. And what do we do with that? So the messaging today is quite clear. This isn't niche anymore. Repowering is a mainstay in the strategic landscape of energy transition. And there are a number of facets to it, from the communities, which are perhaps the most important part, because we can't do it to the communities, we must do it with them. And perhaps we've got an opportunity to get that done better than we have in the first rollout. And then we've got all the efficiencies in the supply chain and the skills that come with that as well. So I've perhaps spoke too much there. I've maybe given us a little bit of an introduction. I'm delighted to hand over to my fellow co-director who helped me set up ReAmp, and that's Alison. Alison, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's great to see so many of you here this afternoon. It's certainly a hot topic on the reappearance of winter, as it seems to be in Edinburgh today. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you all of the answers today. Repowering doesn't have an easy solution, and I don't think we're going to be able to say to you, here's the solution. But what we want to do today is to give you some things to think about, and we'd be delighted to carry on discussions with you. If what we say today plants some seeds and raises some questions in your own minds about repowering and at all that it entails. From my point of view, I'm really just going to think about it from the sort of consenting point of view, and think about some of the projects that are out there now that are in the public domain, and to flag some of the matters and the considerations that developers and consultants need to be thinking about as they start on a repowering journey from a consenting perspective. I think in sort of looking at the projects that are in the public domain at the moment, there isn't a one size fits all solution. There isn't a standard approach. There's a number of options, and just thinking about different ways of doing it, sort of, and referring back to projects that are there at the moment. Hagshaw was Scotland's first commercial wind farm, and in order to sort of look at the repowering of that, a master plan, the Hagshaw Energy Cluster approach, was developed, and that was moved forward in consultation with a number of developers and a number of stakeholders. It was quite a quick application in terms of determination. It was submitted in December 2018, and was consented in February 2020. So the time period there was less than 18 months in terms of getting a decision. Decision making timescales is the subject of a different session, I suspect, but that is pretty good. But there was an awful lot of front end work going into that. Windy Standard has also been consented. It took longer to get through the process. It took about 2.5 years to go through the process, and it took the approach of getting a repowering consent for Windy Standard 1, which is part of a number of Windy Standard developments. So that was sort of looking at one part of a complex and doing it in that way. Ben Akatil is a project up in Skye, which was submitted to the ECU in the summer of 2023. PLI happened last summer, and a decision's awaited for that one. So we're nearly 3 years and counting there. And it's repowering of existing turbines, but it also includes an extension. So that's another way of looking at it. Is there more land available? Is there a sort of slightly different solution as part of the repowering process? Hare Hill and Crystal Rig 1 have both fairly recently gone into the ECU as applications, but with, again, Crystal Rig following a similar approach to Windy Standard in that it was repowering one element of a complex of consents. Hare Hill has two main consents on that site, and the application for repowering is looking at repowering or moving forward with consents that would, or a consent that would cover the whole piece there. So different from Hagshaw, where it was just the original consent that was looked at for repowering. There are a number of schemes that are in scoping, and they include Benglass, Novar, Cosumire, and Ben Tarzan. And they're all doing something slightly different. So I think it's really clear that there isn't a one size fits all, there isn't a simple solution. And the solution that's right for your project or portfolio of projects is going to be unique. But what there are some questions that you need to be asking yourself and thinking about as you go through that process. And I'm now just going to talk very briefly about what some of those questions might look like. I think sort of one of the initial things is to start thinking about a consenting strategy for repowering. And as part of that, you need to be thinking about what's your current consent? What does it look like? Is it a single consent? Is it a number of consents? Has the consent been modified in any way, shape or form? Have there been Section 42 applications and things like that? Have you got all the paperwork for those consents? Certainly in discussions with some developers, paperwork from 25 years ago has to be unearthed and things, and it's really important that we can go back to those original consents. Is it appropriate to look at extending the lifetime of the existing consent? Does that help you as part of your consenting strategy? Is there potential for additional land to be brought into the system? Does your landowner have more land that could be used to further develop and optimise the site? Does the neighbouring landowner have an interest in having wind turbines? These sort of questions are all really important. Are there other sites in your portfolio that should be considered at the same time? If you're looking at a portfolio of sites in Argyll and Bute or in Aberdeenshire, how are you, when you start those discussions with consultees and things, what are you saying about other sites? And looking at your portfolio as a whole is really important. And I think the other question everybody has to seriously ask themselves, and it came up in the Scottish Renewables repowering discussion that happened last week, was, is the site actually suitable for repowering? Is this the right thing to be doing with this site and things? And I think it's really important that that's one of the early questions that are asked as part of the consenting strategy process. I think there are a number of considerations that need to be thrown into the mix. What's changed since consent was given? What policy has changed? What baseline has changed? What background has changed? All of that sort of thing is really important. Really important to understand how repowering could be done. Speaking to people who work in construction, how do you remove turbines while keeping other turbines spinning? Is that what you want to do? What elements can be reused realistically? Tracks may have to be upgraded, that kind of thing. What does that mean? So what are the practicalities of repowering and things I think is really important? What can genuinely be reused? And then I don't want to go into the Woolmuir question, but what is the project and the grid connection, and how is that being factored into the process? We're not going to touch on grid today, but obviously grid connection is a vitally important part of the repowering discussion, as will be landowner discussions and things. And Will's already mentioned the need to be in touch with the local communities and things, and the need to do this with them rather than to them and things. There's lots of discussion around what you actually call it, and is it repowering or is it redevelopment? Both of them are referred to in MPF4. Policy 11 of MPF4, as you all know, probably does refer to repowering, but there's also lots of support for redevelopment, and in a lot of other industries this would be called redevelopment if it was a retail estate or something like that. I think we're starting to see some really interesting discussions about brownfield land, derelict land, how it falls into those categories and things. There are some interesting definitions there. MPF4 does contain a definition of brownfield land, and I think it's important to think about the messaging around it and how that's coming across. Um, as we've said, early approaches to the consultees, local community, host local authorities, all of that kind of thing is going to be really, really important. This is just the start of it. There are so many questions, and I know I've just scratched the surface of them, but I think it's the sort of things that we all need to be moving forward with and thinking about as we move forward. In terms of thinking how you do it legally, that's where Eversheds can help out. And I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk about some of the legal practicalities associated with repowering.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, I did wonder whether this was going to be my first call in about a month without the mention of Muir, but we didn't quite manage that. Never mind. We're going to be speaking here obviously about the second hottest topic in the renewables sector of the moment, perhaps behind Muir, albeit one that I'm hoping we can all get more excited and enthused about. So yeah, thanks, Alison. I'm really grateful for you focusing on the practical issues associated with repowering. Um, it is important that we have an eye on how we can improve law and policy, but there's no escaping that change in those areas is going to be slow, and that commercial pressures and opportunities often move much faster. So I think we do need to be focusing on the here and now. How do developers best promote a repowering project within the constraints of the current legal and policy framework? For the next few minutes, I'm going to assume a couple of things. First, that there's a degree of confidence around a repowering project being viable. So you've done some of that initial feasibility work that Alison's touched upon. And second, that we all understand the business as usual mechanics of promoting a wind farm development. And what that will do is it will buy me a little bit more time to talk about the unique challenges of consenting a repowering project specifically. There's four things I'd like to cover. Firstly, thinking a little bit about timing. Second, procedural solutions or routes. Thirdly, decommissioning strategy. And fourthly, just touching on some case making considerations. So I'll start with timing. The first question, of course, when does your operational consent expire? An imminent expiry may well obviously force an expedited repowering program, or I suppose if it's really tight, and as Alison's touched upon, it may drive a two-stage consenting process with a life extension safeguarding your operational project, avoiding you having to start complying with those decommissioning conditions, and then it also buys more time for a subsequent repowering application to be prepared and submitted. I should say though, from my own experience so far, it's often technical or commercial factors that force an early repower rather than necessarily the long stop date on your consent, which in itself actually throws up some really interesting questions. For example, where there is perhaps a commercial necessity to progress a repower, but a lack of certainty as to when new grid capacity will come online, and therefore there's a tension around the timing of promoting a single planning application. So I think this, amongst other factors, again, some of which Alison's touched upon there in terms of adjacent land being available, for example, these are encouraging developers to start thinking about potential split scheme consenting strategies. So you promote an application for an initial set of turbines, but are forced into a second submission, perhaps at a later date, for the remainder of what will be your optimal project ultimately. Which legally takes us into some interesting procedural considerations. Specifically the consenting procedures that will apply depending on the totality of the scale of your project, which may often be fundamentally a single generating station under the Electricity Act. So by way of example, in Scotland, we have that 50 megawatt threshold under Section 36 of the Electricity Act. So it raises the question, what happens when you are planning two separate sub 50 megawatt phases of development that will collectively deliver a generating station in excess of 50 megawatts? In that case, do you submit an initial planning application for phase one that's ready to go, and then it's a Section 36 extension application down the line? What happens if you want to submit that second application? It's good to go, but phase one has not been granted yet. Should you be applying for another planning application in that scenario? Or are you approaching the ECU about a Section 36 extension? Because after all, collectively, once it's all consented, hopefully, you're looking at a 50 megawatt plus generating station. I suppose the third option is you simply delay phase one and wait for phase two to catch up. So effectively paving the way for a single all singing and dancing Section 36 application. Much neater, much tidier, but a potential project killer, I suppose, if it delays the early installation of some larger, more efficient turbines. I think it's worth just saying as well that a single consent strategy can also come with some complications. So again, just to give an example, there may be a consent, say, for 20 turbines, and a commercial incentive to build out the first 10 because of the availability of grid, but then a subsequent necessity to freeze development, potentially for quite a long period of time, until that further grid capacity becomes available, and there's a business case for building out those latter 10 turbines. I think that does raise some interesting points. The partial build out of those first 10 turbines, with potentially quite a big gap between initial commissioning of those and the later construction work of your second phase. So there's some thinking to do, I think, around the consenting risks associated with that, and how those might be addressed by how you structure a consent. Can it contemplate how you're actually going to build out your project? Just briefly on decommissioning, I think that can, and there's examples of this out there across some of the schemes Alison's touched upon. I think in principle that can be done either under the conditions of the old consent or under the new consent. I suspect that we'll trend towards more developers applying for decommissioning under the new repowering application, partly because of the opportunity to espouse some of the benefits of reusing existing infrastructure, sustainable development, and the like. Another really interesting point just on decommissioning is thinking more about that decommissioning strategy. And this is quite unique to a repower. Is there a potential need to contemplate the continued operation of some of those older turbines at the site, whilst elsewhere at the site decommissioning and putting new turbines up? So some interesting points there in terms of making sure that that's all above board in your consent and any discharge of a detailed decommissioning strategy. Just briefly on case making from me, and I'm quite keen to finish on a positive. There are some unique challenges and risks associated with the repowering project, but I think, again, touching on some of what Alison said, planning policy does generally like repowering, the same way it likes all forms of low carbon generation, certainly under national policy in Scotland. And there is some helpful non-energy policy that only a repowering project can access and benefit from. From my perspective, I'd also seek to adopt a similar approach around case making for any extension element. So where you're stepping outside that red line of your existing operational site. There does seem to be a trend recently. The direction of travel seems to be that the repower stops at the red line boundary of the existing site. And I understand the reasons for that. But the reality is that bigger turbines will need more space. And without that extra land, there may be no repowering project at all. So it's a policy case making point, and perhaps more one for the ReAmp guys. But I would be encouraging a bullish planning statement for any extension project as well. I'll pause there. Over to you, Jerry, in case there's any questions.
Thanks, James. Yeah, we've had a couple of questions in, and I'm conscious we've only got a few minutes, 7 minutes left. So the first one is actually, I think, best directed to William. This is on the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan from NESO, which is obviously setting the course for energy developments, including the capacity distribution for different renewables technologies. And the question is, how does this play into the conversation that we're having? Repowering.
Yeah, good question. SSEP, I suspect, is probably on most people's minds at the moment. I think maybe take a step back slightly. We've got an SSEP that's supposed to be driving capacity and trying to direct where that should go in the GB market. We've obviously had the kind of foundations of that laid through the Clean Power 2030 plans. And people have now working to those. As a result, you're getting grid connections that are gate 2 or otherwise. And that's brought its own challenges, and I could probably speak for 35 minutes on that alone. So I'll just make the point and then quickly move on. I think the SSEP has got an ability to recognise that repowering is going to take place. And I was reminding myself of what the onshore wind policy statement said in this area in Scotland because it came up last week at the Scottish Renewables event, and it is quite clear that not all onshore wind farm development will be repowered because of various reasons that James and Alison have maybe just outlined for us. So I think repowering needs to absolutely be factored into that conversation, and I'm not too sure how much of the stats that I was reeling off at the start of the call have been taken and on board and factored into the analysis that's been made as we try to get towards, let's not forget the not just Clean Power 2030 targets, but net zero. So I think, yeah, in short, it's got a massive role to play, and I'm not sure it's been factored in to the level that it needs to be.
Thanks, William. Yeah, there's a lot to figure out there. We've had a number of questions in actually, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But I think there's a general one that's come in. This picks up on Alison and James, what you were talking about. There are obviously a lot of moving parts with repowering. And as a current site owner and operator, when do you start thinking about your plans for repowering? Alison, do you want to jump in on that?
Shall I go first? Yeah. I think the sooner the better. These things are always better with more time. But that's not always possible in just the way life works, and completely understand that. I think what I'd be encouraging people to do is to start looking at their portfolio, start looking at the sites that are most likely to come offline quickest within that, and to start thinking about some of those very high level questions about what is the portfolio strategy, and then from that portfolio strategy develop into individual site strategies. And as part of that, you may rule out a number of sites that you just think actually it just doesn't make sense to power these. They are sites that were of their time, and in terms of modern policy, modern turbines, modern requirements and things, then it's going to be really challenging, and therefore you focus on other sites that have greater potential, and things, and then to start to develop the consenting strategy around those smaller sites. And it may be that you sort of work through that original portfolio review, and you're then able to prioritise sites and say these are the ones we want to move forward with first, but we've thought about the other sites and here's how they fit into it. I mean, arguably it's a bit like building a house and knowing the grand plan for what you want to finish with, and then building it in stages so that you don't do one thing and then regret what you've done later and things. So the short answer is as soon as possible, but recognising it's not always possible. James, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that, Alison. I think you need to understand what is possible, I suppose, in the first place, in terms of what stacks up. And, we've touched upon some of the key themes around the repowering project. We're obviously talking about bigger turbines, and therefore often there is going to be a need for more land. So you're then into the need for land negotiations and the like. You're in the need into territory where you're perhaps going to have less of an understanding of the environmental baseline of part of your new project, which triggers new survey requirements and the like. So that all takes time. And then putting on my my planning lawyer's hat, once you get to the point of submitting an application, it can get caught in the system for a very long period of time, as we all know. Even some of the most straightforward or seemingly straightforward repowering applications, you're still looking in some cases at around 3 years from submission to determination. So, even if you put all that together, and actually even once you get your consent, you're thinking about discharge of conditions and the like. So when you put all that together, if you're 5 years out from expiry of your operational consent, there's already work to be done to get to the point of what happens next, and also to not be caught by a requirement to discharge or comply with decommissioning conditions under that consent. So I agree with you. Within reason, as soon as possible is probably the answer, Alison.
Thanks both. It certainly seems that there's at least agreement on that much. I'm going to jump back, William, to your answer on the SSAP, if that's all right, just because we've had a follow-up question, which I think we might be able to, in a word, deal with, or in as few words with the time we've got left. So, given repowering is obviously a major project for the renewables industry, is there any sense that repowering will gain much traction in the current grid environment in terms of getting that priority? Do you think it will benefit from any particular treatment in the grid connection reform?
Wow, great question. And thank you for coming to me for that. Yeah, so I think kind of taking a step back, obviously the NESO reforms have taken place. We're still to see all the offers come out. I think at the grid conference we seen 2 or 3 weeks ago now with SR, the NESO were saying 20 offers had been made. I think the remainder of this year and probably into early next year is when all the offers will flow out. So it's really hard to know, to be honest, because those offers, not all of them will be signed, presumably. Some projects will have moved on and won't be able to sign them. So that'll kind of reset the mix in terms of grid. And then, yeah, the repowering projects will start to come in. The projects that hold capacity at the moment, that capacity should be fixed, say should be. But as the points that James and Alison were making and alluding to, is if you've got different size turbines in terms of megawatts and different number of turbines, then are you looking to extend your megawatt connection if you're the continuation of the same developer? I think that then becomes a bit more of a complex answer. I've got some thoughts on how that could work, but I might not say them or share them with you personally if you want to reach out. But yeah, I think that is the key. So maybe wait and see how all the Gate 2 stuff falls, but intuitively feels like repowering should absolutely play into that mix, and what people have got they should keep.
Yeah, great answer, thank you. And that's pretty much all we've actually got time for. And there were a couple of other questions. So if you've sent a question in that we haven't answered, we will follow up with you. And if you had a burning question that you didn't manage to put into the Q&A, please do follow up with us afterwards. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. Thanks very much, everyone.